now. Look, cinema is continuing to grow as we speak today. And in fact, Brian's off to the next thing, experimenting with all sorts of cool stuff. He has digital menus now in his theater so that he can customize what they're serving you as a meal based on who he thinks your demographic background is. He's actually even experimenting with robots to deliver the meal to you, at a distance. Brian is constantly thinking about the next big thing. And it doesn't mean that he predicts the future, but he's constantly imagining what might happen, not just what's happening now. And that is probably the most important thing. I admire Brian Schultz for many reasons. He's an incredibly smart guy. He's a person of incredible integrity, as we saw during the hardest times. But more than that, for the rest of us, the thing that we can learn is that Brian is truly future-focused. Brian is constantly thinking about what might happen, not just what happens now. And as business leaders, this is really important. Because, as you all know, the world is changing. And the world is changing rapidly, right? And we see it in all sorts of different ways. We're always collecting, at Jump, we're collecting all sorts of headlines and stories about what's going on in the world. And the headlines are constantly coming out with all sorts of crazy stuff. Quantum computing is actually depending on the multiverse. AI is entering all sorts of new decision-making that we hadn't counted on before. Ozempic is actually changing how we look and what we're eating. The headlines go on and on. You can see just a smattering of some of this stuff here. If you haven't come to San Francisco, where I live, you should come because, self-driving cars are a reality. You get into a car and there's no one in the driver's seat today. So the world is changing. And the problem with that, for us as business leaders, is that companies that aren't future-focused, that aren't thinking about what's happening in the future, get fracked. Now, what do I mean by fracked? Fracking, as many of you know, is a hydraulic fracturing, right? It's a technique that the oil and gas industry developed, which is to say that you can break rock miles underground and pull out oil that you otherwise didn't have access to. It's something that has actually made the United States a net oil exporter now in a way that had stopped for several decades. But it's also a great metaphor for what we're seeing in business. I mean, think of it this way. Imagine that you're a farmer in Ohio or Pennsylvania, right? And you're a really good farmer, and your family's been on that farm for 3 generations, and you're doing a great job as a farmer, but unbeknownst to you, a mile down the road, there's an energy company that is breaking shale rock 50,000 feet under the ground, and it is leaching up all sorts of methane gas and all sorts of fracking chemicals into your water system. And you wake up one day as a farmer and you go to your kitchen tap and you turn your water on and your water light's on fire and you have to move. You have been fracked, meaning that your lifestyle, your livelihood have been disrupted by external forces beyond your control. And we're seeing that not just with farmers, we're seeing this with all sorts of companies too. We're seeing companies that are getting fracked a lot. We're seeing companies that are getting fracked a little. Over the last 10 years, my colleagues and I at Jump have actually come up with a list. We call it the fracked list. It's companies that are getting fracked a lot or a little. Would you like to see that list? This is the fracked list. This is the top level of the fracked list. It's not all of them, but you can see over on the left-hand side are companies that are totally fracked. Fracked like some of them like fracked and dead, like Kodak or Circuit City, but also ones that are in a tough spot like Bed Bath & Beyond and JCPenney. There's all sorts of companies that seem to be totally fracked. The next column over are companies that are getting fracked today. These are companies that are under threat. Places like AT&T and Coca-Cola, because we're not just drinking Coca as much as we used to. Cereal companies are in that third column because people aren't eating cereal like we used to. Cereal consumption in the United States is declining 4% a year. By comparison, cigarette consumption is only declining 3% a year. So it doesn't matter how good you are at making Fruit Loops. If you're in that column, you are getting fracked. And so companies are struggling when they're in that position. The next column over are people who we consider who are fighting fracking. They are showing tangible evidence of taking their own destiny in their hands and actually doing something about it and changing the world. People like BMW or Disney is in that world. They're experimenting and trying new things with streaming. Microsoft is doing something there, right? I love that we've got the New York Times in the list of people who are actually fighting fracking. I mean, think about that. The New York Times is a newspaper. It's over 100 years old. Right? And yet, they're actually fighting fracking. They make more money from their cooking sites and from their game sites now than they do from the news. How many of you have played Wordle or any of their games that they have there, right? Yeah. They are constantly thinking about how can they reinvent themselves. And then on the right-hand side, those are the list of the people who are actually doing the fracking, friends. These are folks, this is the usual suspects, people like Netflix and Amazon and Google, Novo Nordisk in terms of coming up with Ozempic. These are the folks who come up with new disruptions that make life more difficult for the rest of us. These are the folks that we call the actual frackers. Now, there's a bunch of folks down at the bottom who you may not have heard of, people like Facet and Cureleaf and Upside Foods. Right? And these folks are much smaller. We call these the little frackers. And the little frackers, it's easy to look at them and say, oh, they're so small. We don't have to pay attention to them. They don't matter. But you got to watch the little frackers, because if you don't watch the little frackers, sooner or later they grow up to being big frackers. And if you were paying attention to the big frackers, then you're really fracked. Right? So you got to know this stuff, and you got to watch out what's happening, because otherwise the world is changing and companies that don't respond to change get fracked. Now, this is just what's happening with companies, which is fine. But there are bigger challenges that are out there in the world, things that matter even more than the success of an individual company. Show of hands, how many of you have brothers, sisters, or kids, or a family that you care about and that you're worried about, right? So folks like you, if you have that kind of family that you are intently worried about, there's a bigger list I wanted to show you. And that's not just our frack list. There's something that we call our bigger scoreboard. It's what really keeps me up at night.